Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of the ASSFN podcast. I'm Danika Paulo, PGY6 at Vanderbilt.
And I'm Tessa Harland. I'm a PGY4 at Albany Medical College.
And I'm Robert Ziechmann. I'm a PGY5 at Temple.
And today we're pleased to have with us Dr. Peter Konrad. He was a professor of neurological surgery and director of the functional neurosurgery program here at Vanderbilt for several years, and recently became the chair and professor of neurosurgery at West Virginia University, as well as the executive director of Integrative Neuroscience and Clinical Innovation. So it is a true pleasure to have Dr. Konrad with us today. Thank you, Dr. Konrad.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And today we're going to be talking about building a functional neurosurgery program, which is something that Dr. Konrad has lots of experience with. So, Dr. Konrad, can you please tell us about your experience building the functional neurosurgery programs both at Vanderbilt and West Virginia? And in your opinion, what is essential for a successful functional program?
Yeah, it's probably one of the questions I get asked a lot about. And there's pieces that people should know about that process. So I think, it's like any neurosurgical practice. You have to really understand where your referrals are coming from, how your operations are managed, and then where are the efficiency points you really want to see your program grow. So functional neurosurgery is one of those areas of neurosurgery that has a high codependency, I would say, on other disciplines. So there's very few functional neurosurgery programs I can think of anywhere in the world that exist as sole neurosurgery run programs. So by codependency, I mean, we depend on relationships with neurologists, psychiatrists, neuropsychologists, neurophysiologists, because that's the nature of what we do, since most of what we treat are not pure structural problems in the brain, but involve circuitry and behavioral implications. We need these people. And so building a functional neurosurgery program basically involves like planning and integrating all those pieces together. And it doesn't start out all at once for most people growing a program. It starts out in pieces and you work with what you have available. When I started in 98 as a attending, it was basically Dr. Charles and Dr. Davis and I. We didn't have a neurophysiologist at that time, and we had no neuropsychologists or anything else, but that was where the program was at. And then quickly within a year, we saw a need to begin having neuropsychology work with us. And then shortly, by 2000, I think it was the year 2000, we had hired Dr. Cow to come in as our physiologist. And the program just grew in pieces. And you do that when you begin to show revenue stream that justifies hiring more and more people. And that's kind of how it is here too at WVU. Although I came here to a program that was already pretty well established by Dr. Razai, and now an extra member in a 4-man adult team with a pediatric component now too. But the successful piece to all of this is really understanding the team concept.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience. It's really helpful to understand the processes that you went through. In regards to your experience specifically, what have you found to be the biggest challenges or obstacles to building a program that you've encountered, both anticipated and unanticipated? And how have you seen these challenges change over time as the program and the providers have developed more experience?
Yeah, I think this is always a process and evolution. So I'll just tell you, today more than it was in '98 when I started, and even in 2000. I mean, over the last decade or two, more and more challenges in functional neurosurgery revolve around everything in healthcare, and that is revenue stream to support the services that you want to offer. And so initially, I would just recommend for anybody that's starting out on a program, you really have to come to a thorough understanding of some basic, simple facts. One is the anticipated number of patients flowing in to the healthcare system, not just to the neurosurgery practice. but to your partner's practices, whether it's neurology or psychology or neuroimaging, for instance, or neurophysiology. And then with that, you have to work with a business administrator who has a handle on what all of those practices will contribute in terms of RVUs and dollars to the overall operations. Once that understanding that business piece is the only way today, and in my opinion, other than having a windfall of money that's just given to you, but it's the only way you're going to have a sustainable practice program. You can rely on gifts and donations for a short period of time, but the ability to continue doing functional surgery really depends on how well you understand those pieces and how much you can grow. So, for instance, if you're at a place that is, like, for instance, if you're in a large city and there are 4 other major functional neurosurgery teams around you, then you have to be very careful that you don't overstretch your resources because the patient population just may not be there. If you're part of a healthcare system that's acquiring more practices, then that's a whole different planning strategy. If you're the sole provider of functional neurosurgery offerings in a region of a 4 to 6 hour radius, which was a little bit what Vanderbilt was, then you grow at the pace that you basically can hire providers at, because the supply is almost endless compared to what your provider resources are. So that's the challenge of starting and growing a program, because you're really in it with the hospital and the resource allocation. Now, over time, what will happen as more providers join the team and mature is that if you're in an academic program and not just offering clinical services, more and more of the providers that are academicians are going to want to have some protected time to do academic things. And so then you have to start building in discussions about, what does that look like? Why would your institution want to support that? And where's the dean fit into that picture? What's the mission of the various departments, and how well aligned you are as a neurosurgeon with neurology and psychiatry and neuropsychology and the radiology departments depends then on how much overall resources go towards allowing academic mission to come forward. But, again, the mistake would be to believe that academic mission today overrides clinical services when it comes to growing a program, and that's never true. The base is always, in your thinking, should be, what's the services we need to provide, and do a good job with that, whether it's dealing with Parkinson's, epilepsy, or pain management, for instance. And then the research evolves from that, honestly. You can't hire a bunch of researchers when you have no patients to take care of, but you sure can hire an endless supply of researchers when you have an abundance and an endless supply of patients.
It seems that in any practice setting, there's a lot to consider and kind of walk a fine line in terms of balancing resources. So, Dr. Konrad, could you tell us a little bit about the unique setup at West Virginia at the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute, and how having many of these services and research under one roof can kind of help collaboration and treat patients holistically? And then what would you advise to other practices, to other institutions hoping to build collaboration between different departments and disciplines?
Yeah, so this is where I'm at now is a very different model than where I was at Vanderbilt. And there's, pros and cons to everything. And a lot of it is, opportunities that you make of what you're given. Being in an institute model, as opposed to a department model, which was sort of where Vanderbilt is at, in the sense that, and when I mean institute now, again, specifically, I mean management of your resources and control of your resources. So when you're in an institute like here, we have for instance, 4 clinical departments and 1 graduate department that all roll up under one administrative team. So the Department of Neurosurgery, the Department of Neurology, the Department of Behavioral Medicine, or Psychiatry as some centers would call it, and the Department of Neuroradiology, which we have as a uniquely different department than Department of Radiology. So we have our own neuroradiology department. Those are all clinical departments. And then we have a Department of Neuroscience, which administers graduate degrees, and we have master's and PhD students that come in for that, and they're just rolling out an undergraduate program. So all those 5 departments basically have a common theme of taking care of patients with neurological disease and training people in the area of neuroscience, and also then providing research in those areas. That revenue stream, again, is what ties all this under one administrative roof at the Institute and allows us to make budgetary decisions. Like if we feel that there's value in buying a new MRI scanner, or for instance, buying another ultrasound unit, that just doesn't fall under the Department of Radiology to acquire that and try and figure out how to cobble enough revenue to pay for that. We can make that decision across all 5 chairmen with the Institute's leadership and just say, this is the best for our whole program. And we're not going to hold one department responsible for the cost of that, but it's going to be shared across it. So the Institute can share costs and also revenues in a much broader sense. The other thing that an institute by its nature does is it's an investment by the medical center, as I've learned, in a signature service line. So universities and medical centers don't set up institutes for convenience of organization. They set them up because they become a priority of patient care for that medical center. So in typical medical centers, we'll have about 4 or 5 institutes. Like here in West Virginia, we have a Neuroscience Institute, which has been endowed with some seed money from the Rockefeller, so it's called the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute. We have a Heart and Vascular Institute, we have a Cancer Institute, and we have an Eye Institute. And those institutes basically receive priority infrastructure and emphasis in the rest of the medical system to focus growth and patient care in those areas. Not that other areas aren't taken care of, but these are priority areas. At Vanderbilt, there's an imaging institute, for instance, that's uniquely structured within that medical center, whose priorities are basically provide not just imaging services for all kinds of things, but it's very focused on neuroimaging and the research and the training that goes along with that. So that institute, I was around when that got started, and it is a priority of the medical center to maintain that institute, at least from what I understand still today. And they have a Cancer Institute, and obviously Heart and Vascular Institute. So a lot of the service lines are the same, but it's really boils down to the management of the operations, whether they're handled individually by each department or whether they're collected under a common leadership. That's what makes a difference. At the Rockefeller Institute, last thing I'll say is, just to give you a scope of that, my department now, I have 13 neurosurgeons in Morgantown at the main academic center and another 12 at regional hospitals. So I have 25 faculty in our department. And that's a reasonably good sized neurosurgery department. But adding that to neurology and neuroradiology and behavioral medicine, the Institute at a larger scale, we have 300 faculty and 1,800 employees. And so when you start looking at a larger scale of operations, you begin to really accomplish things at a bigger level. And so that's the advantage in my mind, of kind of creating an institute. And I will guarantee you that you're going to see more medical centers investing in institute models because they just see some advantages economically and economy of scale.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your perspective and expertise on that. And, congratulations on recently becoming chair of the Department of Neurosurgery at West Virginia. How has your perspective on program building changed since becoming chair?
a lot. You would never have heard me talking about all this 2 years ago because I wasn't in the mode of thinking that I am now. But honestly, a chair's job is um, very it's somewhat different, but not that different from being a section leader. For instance, like I was at Vanderbilt, where I was just heading a functional section, and we had three faculty members with me and some resource people, maybe 20 people around me that I was responsible for salaries and research and all of that. You stay very focused in that world, but when you become chair, basically you step up to managing a larger team, and as a result, you really have to understand the bigger roles that your department plays in the system at large. So I do not have a business degree, but you definitely have to begin learning the language and understanding the perception of neurosurgery in a larger role than just functional neurosurgery. That's that sounds very boring and pedestrian for people who love academics, but the reality is no matter what role you play as a neurosurgeon, whether you're pediatric neurosurgeon or spine surgeon or functional neurosurgeon, in the end, you really want to practice your specialty by taking care of patients and being in the operating room. And it all boils down to the same equation. And that is, how do you take good care of patients and get your referrals and, do the right thing, teach people, maybe explore some interesting questions. And being chair just means you got a lot more instruments you're having to oversee than a few. It's actually been more enjoyable than I thought it would be. At first, my myopic view of chairs was that a lot of times you just spend most of your day in boardrooms and meetings and don't get to do anything fun. In some sense, that's true, but in other ways, it's not true because you're constantly being expected to create vision and structure. And I actually enjoy that. I mean, at this point, once you've done a lot of the operating room aspect of things, the next thing most people want to do is, like, if they're good at something, they want to share it and they want to grow it. And that's essentially where people like myself are at towards the latter side of our careers. We want to carry vision forward in a bigger scale. A chair's job has been really good for me on that. And I always enjoyed mentoring. So for a lot of those reasons, it's been a good transition for me.
And you mentioned from a chair perspective, being on sort of the business side of things and having to make decisions on prioritization. And you also mentioned within the realm of the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute that, there are multiple departments embedded within that. In
Yep.
terms of recruitment, who would you say are the essential personnel within a functional neurosurgery practice? And what recruitments do you try to prioritize or would you recommend prioritizing?
Oh, yeah. No, that's a real good operational question. So let's take a few different stages of maturity in a program. So the first stage, let's say you're a brand newly minted functional neurosurgeon coming out of fellowship or residency, and you're tasked to take from ground zero a plan forward to build a functional neurosurgery practice. So all of our fellows that come through, they're in that mindset, and this is part of the things I try and teach them is, like, how do you actually start a practice if that's where you're going to go? And you really don't know because the job opportunities are quite varied. You can either join an existing group or you may be asked to start one program up. So this is very germane. If you're starting out, and the first questions I always get people to start thinking about is, okay, where are you going to get your patients from and how many are there going to be in your environment? If you're a person that's hiring you, and if you're a solo functional neurosurgeon in a group of maybe 4 or 5 neurosurgeons and the hospitals says, I think we ought to have a functional neurosurgery program here, that'd be the first question I would ask. Well, how many the 3 buckets of functional neurosurgery in my world are epilepsy care, movement disorders care, which is Parkinson's, ET, and spasticity. And then the third bucket is pain, which can be vastly ranging from trigeminal neuralgia and really complex cancer pain to low back pain, radiculopathy, neuralgias, and that sort of thing. But those are the three big buckets. So depending on what you want to bite off, you should immediately get from the business person asking you that is how many patients serve those diagnoses in the region, and who is the referring source for that? Because that's your starting point as a neurosurgeon. Then the second question is do I have any partners in this? Do I have a neurologist who knows something about movement or epilepsy, or are there pain management physicians who can send me those cases? If you don't have any of those people, then the next question is you got to at least have one supporting neurologist to help grow that practice. Otherwise, you're not going to have the bandwidth and time to manage what probably is 70% of the patients coming in for referrals needing first initial medical therapy and not just surgery. And as neurosurgeons, we just don't understand the breadth of managing, for instance, Cinemet and COMT inhibitors and other drugs related to a dopamine agonist therapy and polypharmacy behind treating Parkinson's. This gets incredibly complicated, of which neurosurgeons just get a glimmer of that background in. Epilepsy, same thing. The majority of patients who are inquiring about epilepsy for surgical management probably are being referred by primary care doctors or general neurologists who really don't know, first step is optimizing their anti-epileptics. Maybe 2 or 3 anti-epileptics need to be considered or taken off the regimen. And then a inpatient workup for epilepsy needs to be done. And how do you localize seizures with reading EEGs? And I mean, all of that, as you run through that algorithm, generates like, gosh, who's the epileptologist that might be partnered with me on that? Do we have any EEG techs in the hospital that need to be hired? How about a neurophysiologist and a neuropsychologist? Because speech and language metrics are important to understand before you operate on something. So, as you're kind of looking through programs and you're starting out and none of those resources are available, you're not going to be able to get a full plate of epileptologists, movement disorder neurologists, pain management doctors all in one setting. You got to kind of pick and choose the market that you think you will most likely to succeed in first. That's the way I would do it. And then see how hungry and fast you can grow the other things depending on what you want to do. If you're joining a group of 1 or 2 functional neurosurgeons, then in all likelihood, they're already successful to some degree with having supporting other specialties with them. And then you just want to figure out what's your role. Are you all doing the same surgeries, or are you going to subspecialize in somebody's your main epilepsy guy, somebody's your main DBS guy, somebody's doing your pain, which tends to be the traditional way most multi-doctor functional practices go. Although there's a limit to how much you can parcelize all that out. I think, again, functional neurosurgery is not that big of an area that you can be so specific that you can't like cross cover for each other. Most of the, at Vanderbilt and here, we definitely cross cover each other to the extent that we can. So you just have to realize what the nature of the practice you're going into. And if you're in a very large academic program whose primary emphasis is, you're hired to do functional neurosurgery, but you're also expected to be productive in papers, grants, and everything else, then you should be really clear about how much time do I get to write and move in the academic world, and am I punished for that, meaning I don't get paid for that, or is there an expectation of how many papers or grants I get, and what resources would I get to be successful at that, and how much time am I expected to maintain my clinical practice along a certain path. And that then means you're having a conversation with a chairman and not a hospital CEO or a person, because that's an academic program. And the chairman already has an idea of that, or maybe they just want to hear you lay it out. But, there's different layers or different entry points, I would say, for people coming into functional neurosurgery. And they just have to, again, step back and I think divide it out between what's my clinical expectations, what's my academic expectations, and where's, it's the 3 legs of everything: research, teaching, and clinical care. And maybe research isn't in the equation for some programs, and it's just clinical care. That's fine. You just got to understand where the conversation's happening.
Dr. Konrad, on the more technical or equipment side, thinking about it from the same perspective of potentially like building up the practice from the ground up, what would you say would be essential to a practice in general? And then again, for example, coming into a situation where there already maybe is a practice established or they're reestablishing a practice, how much would a new functional neurosurgeon want to negotiate in terms of getting equipment that they prefer, or to be flexible with what is available?
Yeah, I mean, there's the I must have list, and there's the I sure would like list. So again, let's take movement disorders because it involves a lot of different pieces. But if you're going to go into movement, if you're being hired or looking at a primary movement disorders job, the equipment issues that you got to understand is like, if you're trained in a program that does nothing but a sleep DBS, let's take that end of the example, then obviously, you're going to want to be sure that the imaging quality that you're used to working with, whether it's O-arm, C-arm, intraoperative MRI, intraoperative CT, I mean, all of those pieces are there. And that the hospital has or at least the chair or whoever's hiring you has a pretty clear idea that that's essential to your practice. And then don't forget, stereotactic frame. And you need to pick a frame of your choice, whether it's Lexel or CRW or ClearPoint or Rosa or Starfix. These are things now that honestly, going into a fellowship really should be training you on, because those are expensive items, and you have to have a sense of kind of what the cost is for that. A place that's hiring a functional neurosurgeon usually should be aware that those are the equipment needs that you'll need. If they don't have it, if they haven't drilled far enough to even ask you like, oh God, or, gosh, what do you mean you need $500,000 or $1 million worth of equipment? Well, we can't do that. Then they're not really serious about you. There has to be some baseline expectation. Now, that's if somebody's starting in a place that has nothing. And our most new applicants to jobs probably aren't going into that scenario. Usually they'll find like, oh yeah, we have a Lexel frame, but we don't have a Rosa. Do you really need that or not? Most of the time, one stereotactic tool is good enough. The other things that add up that are subtle that you won't think of, again, are what your ancillary support team needs. Like, okay, so I have a frame, a stereotactic frame, and I'm trained under doing awake procedures. Don't forget, you got a neurophysiologist that needs to either be contracted or hired. Most places will contract a neurophysiologist. And so a contract for services for that needs to be built in to your contract if you're using stuff like that. Or we need a contract service for a neuropsychologist because we can't even get a surgery approved without a neuropsych evaluation prior to scheduling a DBS, which is pretty much normal nowadays. So you have to have that service in line. Yes, I need something more than a 1.5 Tesla magnet image. We tend to use 3 Tesla images for almost everything we do. So is that available? Or what's the quality of the imaging that you have? Or if you're doing epilepsy, do you have an epilepsy monitoring unit? I mean, there's no epilepsy surgery that I know of that doesn't at least require somebody to go through an EMU, an epilepsy monitoring unit, which means inpatient EEG. That means EEG tech support. In addition to the other things like imaging and stereotactic guidance. So again, the whole point of doing a fellowship nowadays in particular is that the world has gotten so complicated in our technology that it's very hard in one residency program to get acquainted with all of that. And the fellowship should really, train you on at least a few different venues of that so that you have that conversation when you're doing your job search. Again, it does honestly, I think, boil down to having a little bit of business sense about it. And your mentors should be helping you understand that, because they have to justify this. And whatever program you're at, you're not an island. Eventually, somebody from the business office comes down to you and says, hey, you are doing great because you generated this much revenue for our system. Or they'll say, hey, you lost this much money from what we expected you to do. How can we change that for you? And usually they'll want to understand how to improve patient referrals and how to manage your costs. Just get used to the notion that there is some fiscal accountability for any of the places that you may want to land at, and it's not hard. You just have to know where those numbers come from, and also how to help the administration help you be successful.
Certainly a lot of things to consider, for sure. How do you approach collaborations and building relationships with the neurology department, especially one that is new to collaborating with surgeons? Would you recommend that departments focus on recruiting neurologists trained at programs that have some exposure to functional neurosurgery or movement disorder training? Or how do you adequately equip the neurologist side of the team with the tools and knowledge that they need to promote a good collaboration with neurosurgeons?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll just tell you how I went about it, both at Vanderbilt and here. It's kind of the same formula. Again, to me, central to what we started out talking was this whole idea of a team, building a team. And so at Vanderbilt, one of the first people I really wanted to get to know was the neurology chair, because if I didn't get buy-in from them, then any hires that they might think of are just really going to be hard to do. And so when I came here to West Virginia, I was really anxious to meet the neuropsychology chair, the neurology chair, the neuroradiology guy. I mean, I know they all work under an institute, but if I can't have a working relationship with them to understand a common vision of growth, we're not getting anywhere. And then specifically, you're asking, like, how do you get them to understand where the investment should be made? I mean, believe me, if they're looking at you for a job in functional neurosurgery, they don't expect you to do this in a vacuum. They know they have to invest in this because they've already in their mind decided to invest in a highly specialized, subspecialty trained neurosurgeon. That isn't just happenstance. And I would just discourage anyone to explore a job in which they're asking you to say, hey, we want you to do spine surgery, but every once in a while, if you could do a DBS or an epilepsy case, add that into the hopper. That's not really the job you want, not in this area. You want a program that actually understands, like, okay, we're now going to make an investment in this, and what do you need? And then you really have to say, look, if it's movement disorders, a general neurologist is not going to be trained adequately enough to handle all these complexities with a device, medications, inpatient monitoring resources. If it's an epilepsy program, same thing. You need techs, you need somebody other than the general neurologist, you need somebody to staff an epilepsy monitoring unit. That's a full-time job for people just focused in epilepsy. Our epileptologists do not do movement disorders neurology, and our movement disorders neurologists do not do epilepsy surgery. So it's literally mutually exclusive almost. I've never seen that work either way. And I'm not going to go into the pain side of the equation because that's a whole different group of people. Mostly it could be headache management people, it could be pain management people, but for just movement and or epilepsy, you want to have them focus immediately on finding a specialist in that area who has ideally experience in working with neurosurgeons. And then don't forget that a lot of what we do also is support from industry and the societies like ASSFN and the AAN and the American Neurological Association, so that there's a lot of extra courses and training that you can supplement for these people. So if you got a neurologist like, look, I'm a movement disorders neurologist, but I've never dealt with an implanted device. We only deal with drugs in our program, and I'm not sure I can handle managing a DVS implant. Well, that's not hard. They just got to get some extra training in that, and in particular work with their societies. There's tons of training programs that they could get schooled up in managing implants if that's not their normal. But the main thing is their attitude has got to be one of being a partner with you on it and not a handoff. Like, well, I'll refer you the case, and then it's up to you to manage the device and everything else around it, but I'm just going to do the drugs. That's a prescription for a real disaster in your practice. You want to find neurologists who want to participate in the surgical experience, and you, as a neurosurgeon, should really want to participate in the experience of the neurology management of the patient. And specifically, what I mean by that is, as functional neurosurgeons, you should be every bit as interested in how their medication adjustments are going. Ask the neurologist, hey, are we winning or losing on the drugs? Are we getting them off of, dopamine agonist therapy or polypharmacy? That's a big win in the movement world. Or how many AEDs have we come back on? Do they have any seizures? What do you think the strategy should be for that? Because the more you understand their world, then the wins become mutual, and the patient referrals become mutual, and your program grows at that point.
Along these lines, and we all know, and you've alluded to the fact that a strong referral system is critical for a successful functional program. So, how do you balance working within your institution versus reaching out to regional practices? And when you do that, how can you spread the word within the community about the services you provide and essentially build up those referral patterns?
Yeah, that's a little bit easier because it's not that complicated. It's the same success that you would need to have as a vascular surgeon or a spine surgeon, and that is basically um, you have to have the ability to say yes to people when they want to send you something, even though internally you may say that's never going to be a surgical case. The point is that if they're sending it to you as a subspecialist, they're probably out of their comfort zone of whoever's referring it to you, and they just need help getting that person in the right direction. And for every one of those patients that you say yes, I'll see them, but I may not be able to offer them a surgery, but I'll help you figure this out, you're going to get many more referrals that are meaningful, and they'll begin to know your practice over time. That's whether you're inside a medical center or you're out reaching out to the community. So first of all, be approachable and affable, and available. The second part is start taking advantage of your hospital's resources for marketing and outreach. And that takes the form usually of every facility that is hiring a functional neurosurgeon is in the business of acquiring tertiary referrals. And usually they'll have a marketing specialist, meaning somebody who literally goes and looks around the region outside your medical center at local community practices and other areas, and like primary care practices or general neurology practices, and say, hey, how'd you like to go give a grand rounds talk or a talk or a lunch, or go to this practice for a few hours on a Friday or whatever it works out, and just meet the neurologists who are curious and wanting to send things in to you and the center. That is the best way. I mean, you don't have to do many of those before word gets out that you are available and affable and approachable. Then the other thing is, if you're aligned with implantable products, there are industry focused people who will work with your medical center or your practice to help grow your practice, because obviously you share a mutual desire to increase patient referrals for that. And so that actually helped enormously when I was at Vanderbilt. We had wonderful partners with our industry partners who helped us actually reach people who were very interested in getting DVS implants in. And so that they were actually a second layer of kind of communication that we could have with distant practices. But the first thing is just, being willing to go out on an evening or take part of your day out and go visit these people and set up communications. The only other thing I'll say about that too is the one thing that will kill referrals is if you never communicate back to your referring doctor. So if you go out there and say, send me all your great patients, and then you never give them a letter back, or you don't communicate back with them, or you don't somehow manage to call them with any sort of issues, they will just die on the vine immediately, and they'll just send it to the next practice who sends them that information back. So it's a two-way street with those referrals. You got to make them want to send you the patients, and you need to make them feel like they're still part of their patient's care.
So, Dr. Konrad, we've talked about the relationship with neurology. is neuropsychology incorporated into neurosurgery department, neuroscience institute, and how is that relationship built? And are there any other medical subspecialties that we should be thinking about in collaboration?
Yeah, neuropsychology is one of the pillars in which functional neurosurgery depends because it's required by payers anymore as documentation for success of the surgery. Honestly, so we use neuropsychology to basically help us understand if there's other dependencies or behavioral issues that will set that person up for a failure of the surgery, especially with devices. If if patients have mismanaged expectations about their devices, and that's brought out by psychological metrics measured in all kinds of different neuropsych testing, your implants are going to be pulled out as often as they're put in, and the payers know this. It's based on hard data, and so they demand to see neuropsychology reports as part of the normal multidisciplinary workup. The typical multidisciplinary workup for either epilepsy or movement disorders involves a neurologist, a surgeon, and a neuropsychology evaluation. That's almost standard for many of the diseases we treat. So that they have to be part of the team, and they should be part of your conference. They should be familiar with your language about what the surgery intent is. I mean, a neuropsychologist who works with an epilepsy group should know what a temporal lobectomy is versus a callosotomy versus a hemispherectomy versus a local resection, because that has tremendously different implications for what that person's potential deficits may be. Your question also is like any other pieces and parts. The one thing that probably doesn't get talked about enough is the neurophysiologist who actually provides the operating room technical support. In the old days, some neurologists could actually run the MER equipment in the OR. I ran the MER equipment for a few years before I got my neurophysiologist in the OR. That was atrocious, but I did it only because I had a background in neurophysiology, and it was so green. We didn't know much of what to do then, and these people were expensive. Nowadays, most neurophysiology support teams are, I would guess, contracted services by several national agencies that provide a PhD for intraoperative, neurophysiological monitoring through their MER. There's even services that provide EEG analysis now. So the hospital doesn't necessarily have to have as much neurology hires to read EEGs as they used to. And these are evolving business models and practices that are sort of different everywhere. But this is what I would just lump under technical support team. You got to think of that. And then probably the other piece, now that I'm thinking of it, beyond hires in neurophysiology are a good neuroradiology process where you have imaging quality. I mean, we always talk with our neuroradiologists to improve imaging quality and acquisitions because we use so much of it for targeting structures that we want to hit. And so you have to have at least a conversation with whoever's running the MRI and reading the MRIs and make sure they're lined up with your navigation and your other stuff that you're going to use in the OR.
And for those newer attendings, newer departments, newer leaders that are trying to build up a research infrastructure within their institution, what recommendations would you have for them, particularly if there's not already a research institute or collaborations with, say, the biostatistics department or engineering department that may be useful?
Yeah, that's a completely separate bird that needs to be thought of. And this would obviously be for people who are heading into a more academic career. Research costs time and money, and so I think for anybody exploring a job in which research is an important piece to them, I think you have to first make a value judgment of how important is that to you. Is it worth half your time, a quarter of your time? I mean, do you want to mostly do clinical care and a little bit of research, or do you want to do a lot of research and a little bit of clinical care? because the answer to that question dictates how much you're going to ask in your job for protected time. And then the person you're interviewing with, the chair, will usually want some idea as to like, okay, what kind of funding do you anticipate you can get in the next couple of years? If you have a K award coming into a job application, it's obviously a vote of faith already that you're going to be pretty successful at getting federal funding. If you have never written in a grant, never acquired money for research, then you have to do a lot more convincing that you're going to be successful with that in a couple of years. And perhaps maybe you just want to say, hey, I just want to be involved in outcomes research. I want to work with neurologists in doing writing papers and talking about new therapies. Then that's fine. That's a different ask. But if you're really wanting to be heavily involved in bench work and meaning lab work and generate your own stream of funding, you need to have a pretty clear idea of, does that mean 2 days a week? I just am not going to have time to do clinical services. And for those 2 days, I expect, that I will be able to have a grant or something else in place within 2 years. Most chairs now, 10 years ago, it used to be that PhDs and other research personnel were sort of brought in a bigger umbrella of package support for neurosurgeon, physician, scientists. Nowadays, those packages have by and large gone away across all universities and medical centers, not just in neurosurgery, but everywhere, even just general neuroscience programs. And the idea is that research done by a neurosurgeon is not done in a vacuum anymore. It's done with other team members who are full-time PhD people. And so, they sort of expect that either if you've got your own funding stream, then you're still going to be working with PhDs, you're going to have some mechanism already in place. If you're needing that, then you're going to find partners to do that with. And then it's a matter of having a sort of a conversation about how much do you want to trade out your clinical value for your research time, which then gets into pay discussions, and that's a whole nother can of worms, probably better talked about at a different time.
Dr. Konrad, well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights on this topic. There are a lot of great pearls and takeaways from this episode. Any other final thoughts for our listeners and aspiring functional neurosurgery program builders?
Yes. I mean, a lot of people who would listen to this entire session might get very depressed and say, oh gosh, this is not what I want to do. This is too complicated. But honestly, I mean, the whole field of neurosurgery is evolving rapidly into specialized care. And I would just want to say for functional neurosurgery, we have still a really bright future, because many medical centers are awakening to the idea that, this is a permanent offering that people are going to want to take care of neurological disease, different from what we thought of functional neurosurgery maybe 10 or 15 years ago. There's so many more things now that we do that improve quality of life that patients are seeking out as they're getting older, and it's really good. Functional still has probably more different, if you just look at the CPT code book and look up the variety of procedures functional neurosurgery does, I would still say we probably have the largest variety of procedurally opportunities of anybody in any specialty of neurosurgery. And the future for functional neurosurgery is still strong, but you got to understand the environment that you have to survive in, which is now a team environment, and learning that language and thinking about it like a hospital would is going to help you set you up for success.
Absolutely. Great points. Thank you so much. It was a true pleasure having this discussion with you today, Dr. Konrad. And to all of our listeners, please stay tuned for our next episode.